Hey everybody, it's Christina Holloway, and today we're going to talk about perfectionism. Now, if you have a tendency to be a perfectionist, it could show up in a number of different ways. So today we're going to talk about the 3 ways that it can show up, and then we're going to talk about a simple technique that helps you override this tendency, especially if you believe that perfectionism is holding you back on career progress or your ability to work effectively with team members or your boss. Okay, so let's get started. So there are 3 ways that perfectionism shows up. 1, it's externally directed. And here's what I mean by that. You could be working on a project and have deliverables and need to get a report finished or a spreadsheet finished, and you spend an enormous amount of time focusing on every small detail. The problem here could be that you're given parameters for the project. Get all this information to us by the end of the day Thursday, and instead you become so focused on making sure it looks correct or you've collected as much information as you think is relevant that you miss the deadline, in which case you probably have received feedback from your supervisor that spending this much extra time on areas that are not necessarily important at this phase in the project is holding you back from progress, and it interferes with you being able to do your job effectively. That's one way. Another way that perfectionism can show up is if it's directed inward. Here's what I mean by that. I have a client that I've worked with who told me he has perfectionist tendencies, and he had to give a presentation, and he worked very hard on preparing the presentation and got everything correct. Now, the focus with the coaching had to do with making sure his delivery was good and his content was good, because that's what the stakeholders who were going to hear his presentation were most concerned with. After he presented his presentation, I gave him permission to do this, and I said, where did you think you went wrong? Because I knew it was in his head. And he said, I didn't do this right, I said this word wrong, I repeated the same slide twice at one point, and very small nitpicky things. So inside his head, he did not get this done correctly, he felt like he failed, and he directed his perfectionism inward. What was the feedback? Excellent presentation. And all of the feedback was he did great work. He just couldn't hear it because in his head, he just didn't get everything right the way he wanted it to. And you could relate to this, especially if you feel like a perfectionist who might be turning this inward. All right, and the 3rd way to show up as a perfectionist is to dial it up or dial it down while you're facing overwhelm. So you may not have perfectionist tendencies per se, and you may not ever have been called a perfectionist or have it interfere with your work, but you might have leaned into being a perfectionist when you're facing overwhelm, uncertainty, people disagreeing with your decisions, and you suddenly find yourself focusing in one space that if you get it right, then you feel like you've been successful. And that just helps you cope with stress. Okay, so those are the 3 ways perfectionism manifests. It can be externally directed, it can be internally directed, and it can be very specific towards stress or overwhelm. Now, if it's causing problems for you at your job, then what we want to do is change that relationship with perfectionism. So here's how we deal with perfectionism. The first big rule is focus on balance and wholeness and not perfection. So what does this mean? You find the spaces where you can have perfection and you make sure that they don't interfere or impact the bigger deliverable. So for example, let's talk about the first one where it's externally directed. So let's say you have a big project. Your responsibility is to get an enormous report out with a summary of all of the results of this project, and it's going to be something that your stakeholders review in order to move to the next phase of a project. So this is not the final phase. And your perfectionism is stopping you from getting started on your report, and you're going to bump up to a deadline, and you're struggling with, I don't want to miss this deadline, and I also don't want to work at the last minute. Because if you ask a perfectionist to work at the very last minute, they're really, really going to have a hard time trying to get it as perfect as possible in a very short time frame. And that tends to be what happens they have to miss the deadline so that they can focus all of their energy on getting everything perfect. So when we focus on balance or wholeness, what we're looking for here is being able to find perfection inside the deliverable that only comes to maybe 80% or 90%, or even allow yourself a 95%. If you're a perfectionist, you don't want to do anything less than 100. So what we find those areas. Is the spelling perfect? Is the formatting perfect? Find one or two spaces. Is the data that you collected, did you collect it from a perfect source? Is the summary perfect? We have to unpack where you have your perfectionism and then redirect it in one space so that there's balance in the other space. In doing that, you allow yourself to actually deliver something that's just a little less than 100%. You do want to start getting comfortable at finding perfection at 95%, finding perfection at 80 or 85%. Once you start to find perfection in an imperfect space, you've now been able to contain your tendency to undermine your best efforts. Now let's take a look at it from the perspective of turning it inward. I have a client who needed to prepare a presentation. He spent a lot of time trying to get it perfect. He had all his slides done. They were designed exactly the way he wanted to. He had to do his demo. All of it was perfect. He created his own script and followed along so that he wouldn't miss anything. He was very, very meticulous and detailed in the presentation. He practiced it with me. I thought it was great. And our focus on creating the material was content and delivery. A presentation has a number of different elements. So you can worry about, did I get everything right and did I do it all perfect when I was saying my words? But the other half, the half that people are evaluating when they listen to your presentation is, did you present it in a way that kept me engaged? And did you show me the information that I was looking for? Now, for my client, he didn't feel like he did a great job. Then we used a technique of him only worrying about perfection in one space, which was exactly the message he was supposed to convey to the audience who was receiving his PowerPoint. These were stakeholders. And so when I asked him, how did you do in communicating your content? It was perfect. He managed to not say any ums or ahs. He didn't use filler words. He slowed down. His presentation became more well considered. He thought about the words he was going to use. That's the space. That was the space that he wanted to focus on. So as you can see, finding balance or wholeness means you direct your perfectionism in a space that can't really be harmful for you when you're showing progress in your career. You have to give yourself permission to make a mistake and recover from it, because the recovery is the space where you're making sure you took care of it. You can bring in your material at 80, 85%, but your delivery can be 95 to 100%, right? Or 99.9%. So for him, we were able to redirect what it meant to have perfection in a presentation that would probably otherwise have messed him up, where he would have felt low confidence, and if he made a mistake in the beginning of the presentation, he would have lost all of his momentum going forward. So his perfectionism needed to pivot. Once he made a mistake, his perfectionism needed to direct back onto how he recovered from that mistake. Now, the third space, again, we're still talking about the same technique, but the third space is when you lean into perfectionism if you're overwhelmed or you're using it as a mechanism to deal with stress or conflict. Now, in this space, we again want to be able to aim for balance. If you're struggling with, let's say, a project that's going off the rails and you're leading that project and stakeholders are coming after you and asking you a lot of questions, and you starting to want to have everything perfect, and you might be focused on the details. If you're asking for perfectionism in the mundane, in the details that are no longer relevant to the bigger picture, then you may be redirecting your energy because that's the only space where you have control. In that case, again, take a step back, look for balance, look for wholeness. Ask yourself, where am I focusing or directing my perfectionism so that it doesn't undermine my bigger efforts? Now, when you're talking to somebody or you're having conflict or you're not meeting your deliverables and you're in a lot of stress, ask yourself, where can I direct my perfectionism while I'm dealing with this conflict? Now, the better way to direct it might be to direct it to a completely different project. You need to move it. This is a space or a tendency that you need to move out of your current situation so you can deal with that situation holistically. Okay, so to this point, we've discussed the 3 areas where perfectionism shows up. It's either outwardly directed, inwardly directed, or it's dialed up or down depending on stressful situations. Now, the biggest technique that we can use is to find balance and wholeness during this situation. What does that mean? Either find your wins, name 2 or 3 areas that can be your wins that you celebrate as being perfect wins inside an imperfect world, or take your perfectionism and redirect it into something that has low consequence so that it doesn't impact the bigger deliverable of a major project or a major professional relationship with a stakeholder or your boss. You do not want to direct your perfectionism at someone who's a decision maker who can see clearly that it's holding you back. Okay, so that's it for this video on perfectionism. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. Thank you for watching my video. Please feel free to leave a comment if you've ever experienced perfectionism, either through yourself or someone you've been working with, and how that experience played out. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.